It's been a lot of fun to work on this series of lectures to bring forward some hopefully new ideas, or at least to encourage some new thinking. Today I'm talking about challenging the centers of power, and that means basically challenging the power of the patriarchy. I know that's an old-fashioned word, but it's still the best description for those who hold power. The patriarchy controls our government, our business, corporations, our media, the application of our laws. The only way to challenge the centers of power is to wield power, to be at the helm, or vote as a bloc to put in power the people who will represent our interests. The people who are in positions of power must actually believe in female equality and not make promises that they will readily break. We can no longer hope and trust that men will share power fairly and that they'll see to it that women are treated equally because it is the right and fair thing to do. We must do it ourselves. We must see ourselves as equal and insist that others do too. The time has come, but we can only have power if women support and work for other women and see the problems not as personal, but as systemic. Sisterhood is all important. In the first two lectures of this series, Equality of Power: Solutions to the Unfair Treatment of Women, I traced the history of women's inequality. I talked about male physical strength and women's role in reproduction and how that got tangled up to prevent women's equality and entrench women's dependence on men and as men's property. Even in law, that led to an acceptance of violence against women, summarized by Sir William Blackstone in 1765 as, "The husband might give his wife moderate correction, just as he is allowed to correct his apprentices or children." The accepted dependency also led to subordinate positions in the workforce. When women were eventually allowed to work outside the home, they were not paid equally with men. They did not have the same employment opportunities. There was no state-funded help with childcare, and they were expected to do the same work within the home, even though they were employed outside the home. The roles that women played in the workforce were often as supports for male bosses. We all know the term the office wife. I outlined the laws that feminists, and I define that as those who seek fairness and equality for women, have pressured governments to enact. I spoke about improvements still to be made and suggested some ideas for change. And I showed some of the ways that governments obstruct and stall us, such as passing laws but not funding their enforcement, leaving in place the agencies set up to help us, but cutting their mandates and funding, making promises in order to get elected, and then abandoning those promises when they are in office. The question for today is, how do we challenge those centers of power and reshape them toward equity and equality so that women can actually have a chance at living a life of equality? First, in my view, we have to deal with the volatile shifts in policies and programs when a right-wing government beats out a progressive government and cancels many of their programs. It's a matter of historical fact that it is almost exclusively progressive governments that enact positive programs for women, and it is the conservative governments that take them away. Here are some examples of the majoritarian lurches in politics and the impact on policies affecting women. In Ontario, we had progressive governments from 1985 to 1995, first under the Liberals, under an accord with the NDP, from 1985 to 1987, and then the Liberals alone from 1987 to 1990, and then the NDP for 5 years. So for 10 years, when either Liberals or NDP governed in Ontario, women secured pay equity, employment equity laws, family law reform, support enforcement by government agency, increased funding for women's shelters, legalized midwifery, more women in government and cabinet. Then, for those of you whose memory goes back to 1995, the Mike Harris progressive conservative government came into office and defunded pay equity, repealed employment equity, cut funding and staffing to the support agency that was enforcing support payments, changed its mandate, cut social assistance, and much more. When the Liberals returned to office, again this swing in 2003, lasting until 2018, they brought in more progressive policies. They increased the minimum wage, provided more accessible and affordable childcare options, promised more spaces, undertook initiatives combating gender-based harassment and violence, including a specialized program to end violence against Indigenous women and children, expanded OHIP coverage on prescriptions for those under age 25, community-based elder care, a pay transparency act to try to close the gender pay gap, etc. Now, I'm nonpartisan, but it's very easy to see the difference between what one type of party with one type of point of view will present as policy compared to another. So then, after that, we now have Ford's Progressive Conservatives. I don't know, I think he should take the word progressive out of the title personally. They were elected with a majority and immediately delayed the implementation of the Pay Transparency Act, which was going to help pay equity, canceled the planned minimum wage increase to $15, canceled climate change initiatives, canceled the Basic Income Pilot Project, canceled improvements to the treatment of precarious workers, stopped new proactive inspections aimed at preventing wage theft and other employment standards violations, canceled child care plans, and more. We read about it every day in the papers now, so I don't have to belabor it. The same thing happened in 2006 federally when Stephen Harper's Conservatives took power and closed status of women offices and even removed their mandate to work for equality, and canceled an agreed and fully financed provincial federal child care program. The question is, how do we prevent these huge shifts in policies? How do we prevent the government that follows taking away the advances that we've worked so hard for? How can we deal with the tendency of governments which have a majority of seats from pleasing only themselves and not the population as a whole? How do we prevent the swing from one democratically elected dictatorship to another? And how do we ensure that more women get elected? How do we encourage consensus politics? Well, in my view, we have to change our broken electoral system, which allows a party to win a majority of seats with less than 40% of the popular vote, and then behave as if they can do whatever they want and feel they don't have to consider the interests of the other 60%. I believe we need consensus government where everyone has an opportunity to express their views and be part of governance. There was a time in Canadian history, in my lifetime in fact, when the prevailing custom was for even a majority government to seek a consensus of the populace and be prepared to compromise before making a major policy change. This approach seems to be a relic of the far distant past, with our current climate of oppositional and confrontational politics. What we need, for the sake of women and for the sake of society as a whole, is a more collaborative and civil political culture. I believe that proportional representation of the mixed member proportional type, and I'll get to what that is in a minute, is our best bet, both for society as a whole and for women in particular. Then, we need to insist that political parties must run a minimum quota. Yes, I said the word quota in capital letters, boldface. We need a quota of women, and we need women's active involvement in politics. The late Doris Anderson wrote a book in 1991, The Unfinished Revolution, The Status of Women in 12 Countries, that demonstrated that proportional representation in the countries she studied had a beneficial impact on the representation of women. And it was from her work that Fair Vote Canada developed, and after that, Equal Voice. Fair Vote Canada works for proportional representation, and Equal Voice works to get more women elected. So, our present system is called first past the post, or winner take all, an arrangement by which the winning candidate is the one who gets the most votes, even if they don't add up to or even come close to a majority. While this may be fair, where there are only two political parties competing, It's not fair or democratic where there's 3 parties or more in contention. The system does not take into account the overall popular vote, and it means that those who support 3rd, 4th, or 5th parties are not fairly represented in the outcome. Unless the popular vote matters, it's very difficult to elect the people who truly represent the electorate, and especially for us to represent women. In Canada, we now have 5 political parties, 6 if you wish to include Maxime Bernier forming his own, and every election shows how antiquated the first-past-the-post system is. In 1993, the Chrétien Liberals won 60% of the seats with a mere 38% of the votes. And at the same time, the Progressive Conservatives were reduced to 2 seats, even though they had 16% of the vote. In 2011, Harper Conservatives won 54% of the seats with just 39.6% of the popular vote. And in 2015, Justin Trudeau and his Liberals won 54.4% with only 39.5% of the popular vote. Basically, it's possible to win 60% of the seats with 40% of the popular vote. Looked at another way in the 2015 election, it took 38,000 people to elect 1 Liberal MP, 57,000 people to elect 1 Conservative, 79,000 to elect 1 NDPer, and the poor Greens, 603,000 just to elect 1 member of the Green Party. During that 2015 election campaign, at a time when the Liberal Party was in the political wilderness, which is when the best promises seem to be made, Justin Trudeau vowed to make it the last election under the first-past-the-post system. However, in 2017, after achieving a majority government and benefiting from first-past-the-post, 60% of the seats or something close to it with 40% of the popular vote, he withdrew the promise. The fact is, proportional representation is not a radical idea. Other countries have had it, such as Germany, New Zealand, Scotland, and Wales, and in all those places they elect more women because of the proportional representation system. Now, we don't need a referendum to make this decision, just a government with the will, which I thought Justin Trudeau's was, but turned out not to be. The fact is that mixed member proportional was recommended in 2004 by the Law Commission of Canada for the federal jurisdiction. That's what they recommended, that the first-past-the-post be scrapped. But then Prime Minister Harper, when he came into office, not only ignored the report, but paid the Law Commission back for doing it and abolished the Law Commission of Canada. Maybe not for that reason. I can't impute reasoning to him, but that was the result. The Ontario government was persuaded to start a process to evaluate electoral reform. In 2006, Dalton McGuinty's Liberals set up a citizens' assembly to undertake this task. They represented a new kind of democratic decision-making and a first for Ontario, with ordinary citizens recommending policy. The assembly brought together randomly selected Ontario citizens to learn, consult, deliberate, and come to a conclusion. And what they did was recommend mixed member proportional, similar to the one recommended by the Law Commission of Canada. In this system, and it sounds complex, but it really isn't, voters would have 2 votes, one for a local candidate in their riding. So the riding system would continue for basically 70% of the votes, and a party list would be created in advance of the election transparently, and from that party list, people would be selected in order to bring the result in line with the popular vote. Is that clear? Uh-oh. That's the problem. Trust me, it's a good system. It's like everything else in politics, right? In the end, you have to say, trust me. But basically, 70% of the seats are for ridings, and then there's 30% of the seats that are reserved. And if the party got not 20 seats, but they should have had 30 because they had 30% of the popular vote. They get a certain number of seats off the list in order to bring them up to the 30% of the popular vote that they had. Anyway, that referendum that was held after the Citizens' Assembly presented its report, because they'd been promised that they would be able to have a referendum if they made a report proposing a change. It took place, but it wasn't enough, in fact, to create change. The government decided to defund the process. They resisted the process. They changed the rules, and in fact undermined the Citizens' Assembly that they themselves had set up. They pulled the plug on financing, so members were unable to travel the province and explain their process. And they allowed less than 4 months between the result of the referendum and the preparation of the recommendations. And then they set an impossibly high standard of victory. Premier McGuinty changed the rules and said he wouldn't enact the proposed system unless the referendum achieved a 60% supermajority of voters as well as a majority approval and at least 64 ridings. And in the result, the referendum did not find the support of the Ontario populace. But I don't think we should give up. I think that we have a system with these majoritarian lurches from one system to another where we can't keep the new powers that we secure. We can't sustain the changes because the people that come in, the new people, they just keep making changes. You don't know from one year to the next what the laws are that you're going to be operating under. So it's my view, if we're going to challenge the centers of power, that we have to change the electoral system to ensure this consensus government without the overwhelming tsunamis of public policies and programs that occur with majority governments. The impact will also be a better representation of women and other minorities and a more civil and collaborative level of discourse in politics. Instead of the one-upmanship and political maneuvering that comes with the struggle for power, everyone in politics will be more likely to focus on policy issues and, dare I say it, the public good. The fact is that first past the post is essentially undemocratic, and proportional representation is a democratic system where everybody gets the right to vote, gets their vote counted. Then we need, if we're going to challenge the centers of power, we need quotas on women in politics. I suggest that political parties must run a quota of women candidates. Taxpayers subsidize the political parties and therefore have an opportunity to set some ground rules. If parties are made aware that if they don't elect a certain percentage of women or other politically marginalized groups, they'll lose a certain percent of their subsidy. Perhaps this would promote change. In the contest for riding seats, women should have equal access to the winnable ridings and not be sacrificial lambs. In the contest for a list seat, women must be given priority until a fair representation is met. And then, of course, we need women to run for office. We need women to run, and when I say this, I do mean right-thinking women. Yes, yes. Lady patriarchs, I've mentioned them before. Ursula Franklin named them very well. Lady patriarchs are not the goal, feminists are. Feminist women in office can make a big difference. For example, Pauline Marois was the one in Quebec who brought in $5 a day childcare, a model for the rest of Canada. Kim Campbell, when she was the Federal Attorney General in Mulroney's government, made many of the amendments to the criminal code that improved the rape laws as they affected women. Kathleen Wynne enacted a Pay Transparency Act to improve the prospects for women to achieve pay equity in Ontario. This is a brief sampling. We know that at the level of the Senate in Canada, we removed the men and made it all of us in the description of who we are for the national anthem. But if we are to encourage women to enter politics, we must deal with the difficulties women encounter in politics. For example, women are ridiculed and discredited to a greater extent than men, particularly in the online harassment inflicted on them. I know I'm saying that we should have a quota of women to run for politics, and we should encourage women to run and to get involved. And now I'm telling you that they face a difficult road. And that is simply a fact. But there still are things we can do about the difficult road that they're facing. There are threats to women in public office. We know that Kathleen Wynne had all kinds of threats online, and Rachel Notley had at least 3 death threats in her first 3 years in office. But a lot of these attacks are online, and as I stated in my first lecture, when I was talking about violence against women, I believe that a solution to this problem is to make it a breach of the criminal law to threaten and harass anyone online, which of course would include women politicians. Currently, it's not against the criminal law to engage in online harassment, defamation, or misogyny, although this behavior is against the law if it happens offline. We have to catch up with the world as it now exists in a cyber universe. The fact is that misogyny is now enshrined in the criminal code since 2017, thanks to LEAF, as a hate crime, and the next step should be to criminalize online misogyny. Part of this modernization of online harassment and hate is to ban anonymity online. I think it's time to insist that people use their real names online so they can be located and made to be legally responsible for what they do. I would even suggest that the RCMP, as our national investigative agency, be empowered to monitor and bring the power of the law to this aspect of our lives. All women need protection. The criminal laws must be improved and strengthened to ensure women can safely take our equal place in society. So I talked about politics as a center of power, and we all know it is. But at least equal, and sometimes I think of greater power, are the corporations. Certainly the multinationals and many of the large national corporations. They are another center of power, and they're another center of power where women are not having the impact that we should be having. Partly, we can't control them as much as we might have thought we did at one time, because the individuals who are making decisions inside corporations have the benefit of laws that limit their liability for conduct that does not benefit the public. The goal of corporations, after all, is not to promote the public good, but the profits of shareholders. This leads to their opportunity to create income inequality. The solutions to this problem are complex. I was watching recently that film based on the book called The Corporation, which was had some really very interesting ideas. Unfortunately, in the 15 years since those ideas were brought forward, there doesn't seem to have been much change, but it's something worthy of keeping in mind. But I do have some modest suggestions. The securities commissions might establish a code of ethics to which corporations must subscribe, which would include equality and diversity goals. In addition, the security commissions might establish that every board of directors must include a specified number of outside directors, in the hope that these directors would be less tied to the unconscious biases of the existing corporate culture of the particular corporation. Another thing that securities commissions might do is to mandate a minimum number of women directors on every board and board committee. My preference, of course, is to stipulate 50%. These boards might then establish the same minimum requirements for female participation at the management and executive levels. Quotas are definitely a solution for female representation on corporations. British securities expert Lady Barbara Judge said she didn't like quotas, but she still believed they were the only answer, and when she was in a position of power there, she moved to try and bring them in. It's been a long and slow haul to get more women at the leadership level in corporations. Look at California's effort. It just passed in September of this year a law that requires all publicly held companies with headquarters in the state to have at least one female board member by the end of 2019, which set off a scramble for candidates. Some companies with one female director will need to add one or two more because the law also requires that by 2021, publicly held firms with at least 5 directors have 2 or 3 female directors or risk financial penalties. But the start of that thinking of having a quota system was Norway. You know, where is it the Scandinavian countries end up with the most progressive ideas sooner than anyone else? They adopted a quota system in 2008, which was picked up by such countries as France, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and another progressive country, Iceland. This increased the number of women on boards and in executive roles at a pace that far exceeds anything we've seen in Canada. Norway, for example, now has 42% of women on corporate boards. And I don't think there's been a problem. I mean, I don't think that the whole world is blown up because they've had 42% women governing on corporate boards. But what I found very interesting, researchers found that there was no trickle-down effect to improve the representation of women in senior management, which is why I think we have to have a quota at that level too. The 2011 French law required all large companies to fill 40% of board seats with women by 2017. Well, it's 2018. While the statistics showed improvement, the law's requirement has definitely not been met. And our securities regulators in Canada, as I talked about in my second lecture, are still stuck on the comply or explain policy, in which firms must publicly disclose whether they have a written policy on selecting female directors, whether they take gender representation into account in composing their governance structures, and whether they have adopted numerical targets for women on their boards and their executive offices. If companies have not done these things, they must explain why. But disclosure and explanation does not equal action. To achieve equality of power, we need feminists to run for high political office and be part of the corporate governance at the center of power. Yeah, I did say feminists, I didn't say women. We need women at the top who have goals to create equality of power for women. And this includes male feminist allies. Just as there are lady patriarchs, there can be male feminists. They must believe in women and not be handmaidens to the patriarchy who side with men and support a male sense of entitlement. The lady patriarchs play the men's game and survive by being the token females who get ahead without supporting their sisters. I believe that when women have our own power, we will not need to compete with other women for male favor. We also need women to get involved, to speak up, to send letters to the editor, emails to their representatives, support financially those organizations that fight for our rights, such as LEAF, the Canadian Women's Foundation, the YWCA, and others. We need women teachers to educate their female students to women's issues. We need women lawyers to use their considerable skills to benefit other women. We need all women to do what they individually are able to do. But we need more than this. What we need is a national women's organization. In the 1970s and 1980s, we had the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, NAC. And this umbrella organization made a huge difference to the ability of the second wave women's movement to achieve change for women. Because women spoke with one voice, there was one place to call. When the press wanted a quote on anything, everybody knew who was the experts in the various areas, and they knew when to bring certain issues to the attention of the public. NAC was supported by most of the major women's volunteer organizations of the day. It began as an umbrella organization with 30 member groups and ended up with 700 major groups, such as the YWCA Business and Professional Women's Clubs, Canadian Federation of University Women, as well as unions and religious groups. Its goal was to work toward the implementation of the recommendations of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which is why I say at this point, we don't need to have another organization called NAC, but we need a new organization to represent all women. At its strongest, it had 700 member organizations and conducted an annual lobby with cabinet ministers in Ottawa. The problem was, it was government funded, about 90% of its budget. And successive governments, beginning with Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives in the mid to late 80s, started slashing the contributions to their funding. Most of the serious cuts to NAC's funding were done by the federal Liberals. You see what I mean when I say I'm nonpartisan? For those of you who agree with me on the need for a renewed national women's organization, I would say this. Most of the groups that form NAC's umbrella still exist, and they continue to try to form working coalitions on specific issues. But I think it's time to do more. It's apparent that women are rising up, and not only in the Me Too movement about sexual harassment and sexual assault. Look at the strike by female Google employees around the globe because of pay and employment inequities for women, and also because Google quietly paid off sexual harassers. I mean, they're standing up together. This group, massive group across countries, was remarkable and impressive. And I believe that the more that women speak out, the more it is possible for the culture to change. But I wouldn't leave it to government to fund us on an ongoing basis. I think that we should have learned from the past. What I think we need is secure endowment funding and not rely on short-term contributions from governments. I'd rather ask them for a big lump sum up front. A national fundraising campaign would be helpful as well, because if a national women's organization is to be lasting, it must be self-sustaining. It's essential that all women appreciate the importance of women's organizations to our ability to promote change as needed, as well as sustain and entrench the advances made by feminists over the years. Personally, I would like to see an endowment. Hopefully, the government could come up with the money, but one does have to be realistic. I would like to see an endowment of at least $30 million to permit the income from the endowment to be used to maintain a national women's organization and to have an assured, self-sustained future. I figure that $30 million would yield, conservatively, an annual income of about $1 million, which could be enough to staff and maintain an office of experts on women's issues to pursue and speak out for our goals. I even have 2 suggestions for a name for this new organization. How about National Women's Organization or Canadian Women for Equality? The name is less important than its ability to be a credible and cohesive voice for equality. But what is important is that we ask the current progressive government in Ottawa to secure our future with endowment funding. Obviously, I say dream big, right? And plan for a future of equality for women. We have already achieved significant advances. Family law reform, charter equality rights, decriminalized legal abortion, maternity and paternity leave, laws against sexual harassment as discrimination, laws requiring actual consent to sexual relations, pay equity laws, pension sharing rights, shelters and programs to help women who are poor, homeless, disabled, and those who suffer violence, and more. Now what I would like to see is that we have the power, through having women in politics, women in corporations, and a national women's organization that's fully funded, to get the power to achieve some of the suggestions I've made in these lectures. Protection of women against violence and sexual harassment, making sexual harassment a criminal offense, banning handguns because they promote domestic violence, ban this and other reasons, ban the sale and licensing of guns to anyone who's been convicted of domestic violence, involve provincial law societies to control the behavior of the legal profession in dealing with victims of sexual assault. Government-paid legal counsel to assist and represent the victim throughout the proceedings, starting with the first interview with the police. specialized courts with specially trained judges, proactive imprisonment to prevent domestic violence from descending into murder through the use of domestic violence high-risk teams, early intervention, emergency aid, restraints on the perpetrator, substantially increased funding for shelters and legal help for abuse victims, making online harassment, defamation, and expression of hatred a crime, and prohibit online anonymity. Have a national child care plan, long promised, still somewhere outside town. Universal, accessible, and affordable, modeled on Quebec's and now BC's plan, funded by the government and serving not only 9-to-5ers, but also shift workers and emergency needs and weekend needs. Improve and enforce pay equity so that women are truly paid equally for work of equal value. Employment standards laws for precarious workers. Support for unions, and bring back employment equity laws to deal with systemic discrimination. Enforce with quotas women's equal power in companies and corporate boards. Remember, I did say to dream big. Nothing happens without dreaming big and then working together to achieve it. Thank you. No, I'm not dodging the issue at all. I'll tell you something. I think if one could actually just run for prime minister, like in the States where Trump just came in, where if you could just run for prime minister, maybe I would have considered it at one time. Like Trump came in and just hijacked the whole process and ran for the top job. Canada, we can't do it that way. You have to work your way up through the party, right? And in the process, you have to be prepared to work within the party structure. And I guess I'd never felt that that was my thing. But if anybody here wants to promote me to prime minister, I'd give it a shot. Just for you, I'd give it a shot.
Linda, how would you go about setting up a new women's organization? Like, do you already have a whole lot of women that you think would be interested in being part of the organizing group? I think the idea is great, but I just can't envision how it could come into being.
Well, I think that there are a lot of young women today who are looking for a place to express their views, to work for change, and they don't know where to go with those ideas. There's a lot of women lawyers who, of course, have the skills to be of particular use in a situation like that, who are very frustrated by what they see around them. I think that if you put out the call, I mean, you'd have to sit down and have an organizing group. You'd have to put out the call for interested parties and test the waters, right? I'm talking about what's needed when I say we need a national women's group. That's what's needed. But in order to determine whether we'd have enough people to organize it, you'd have to put out the call. I happen to believe that you'd get an answer. And I think that all of these organizations that are right now working together, you know, with coalitions on particular issues, they don't have the credibility in the same way that one national organization would have. And I think a lot of those organizations would participate. They would send their people to participate, and maybe they would help with the funding at the beginning. Because I do think it would be a worthwhile effort. I love that. The first two questions are, how do we do this? And do you want to be prime minister? Okay. Nancy?
If I can just add a comment or two, the Canadian Women's Foundation is looking at the possibility on being a political voice for women across Canada. And they have a lot of tentacle. They do economic development, violence work. So they have connections to a number of groups. The board has to make this decision, and some of you may know that restrictions on lobbying or political foundations doing political stuff has been removed. And so this is all part of the mix that they're looking at, but that's not exactly like being a knack, but it's part of the voice that would be public, and they would engage in some manner experts in just about every field in the country.
Thank you.
And they already have $25 million.
That's pretty good. We only need 5 more. Well, we can't take their 25. Sorry.
This is my first time here. I'm sorry I missed the first two because when I found out about this, I already missed the first one's gone. And then the second one I just could not change my engagement. So that's why I'm here today. Is there a way I could get your first and second lecture somewhere? Is it on YouTube or something?
We are taping them,
Yes.
and they will be on my author's website in due course. And if you want to just give me your email address over there, I'll be sending a notice out once it's ready to be seen, so I could tell you how to find it.
Oh, wonderful, thank you.
Did you do that?
Yeah, and,
Oh, sorry.
sorry.
Microphone. I'm saying if you want notice of when the tapes, the videos of the lectures go up on my website, I've got a pad of paper here on the table. You can put your email address and name, and I'll send you notification in due course.
And would you or do you go to other organizations to give a talk like this, similar?
I have been known to do that.
Oh, so you can if we invite you, right?
It's possible, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I guess I can find out.
I was just wondering how this particular series was set up. Was it your impetus, or was it from the Metro Toronto Library?
They invited me to deliver a lecture or more. I had spoken here last year after my book, which I didn't mention yet, Fairly Equal, Lawyering the Feminist Revolution, when my book came out. And they got back in touch with me and asked me if I would like to do something more. And the idea for it came to me that I wanted to look at it from the perspective of equality of power solutions rather than just complaints. Now, I have a number of complaints, as you know, as you've heard, but the fact is I also focused on coming up with some answers, even if some of those answers could be considered big dreams or pipe dreams. You never get anywhere unless you dream big and unless you really try to accomplish something. And if women put all the energy toward the betterment of the sisterhood that they do for everything else in their life, we could get very far because we've got a real capable bunch of people. Dorothy?
Well, thank you again. I know everybody appreciates everything that you've said, and particularly all those statistics that you've given us, because it's overwhelming, and we need to have it when you give us the actual document, because it's really overwhelming to hear the numbers that you've
Talking
quoted.
to the other mic.
This one? Okay, it's a big echo. I was really glad that you mentioned some of my favorite women, Ursula Franklin and Doris Anderson. I have Doris Anderson's book, and I read it a long time ago, about the Nordic countries and their quotas and we've known about their social policy for many years. And I was really particularly happy that you mentioned changing the voting system for the proportional representation. We tried to do that. I don't know if you must know Lynn MacDonald and the work that we've done over the years in trying to change the voting system. And, the governments, they don't want it because once they get in, as you showed, so do you have any ideas about, because that is a fundamental need now, and it's not going to change without some really major changes. And I don't know if you have any major ideas about how to make it successful, because they didn't allow it to be successful last time, as you've indicated.
Yeah, well, I think that if there were enough women active in politics at the highest levels of all the parties who believed that proportional representation is the way to go, they could persuade them. I would have thought, really, that Justin Trudeau would have been persuaded by the fact that he had been the third party, the Liberals were the third party when he was promoting the idea. And obviously, third parties promote proportional representation because it gives them a better representation in legislatures. So again, I don't think we'll get there without people who are committed to it at the center of power. And unfortunately, increasingly in the first past the post system, all the power really ends up centered in the prime minister or the premier. And they use it. I mean, it's not as if we have a democracy where, I don't feel we have the democracy where cabinet even has a say. Maybe they do because it's cabinet secrecy. We don't know what's going on. But I think we need the women at the top, you know. And I know it's not an easy slog, but I think it's the only solution.
The education process was so flawed before that last program, and people didn't have a chance to really learn what it was, you know, the way you explained it. They didn't get it.
I know, and that was because I think that McGuinty had a majority government, and I guess he had the referendum and he had the Citizens' Assembly because my assumption is it made him look progressive, but boy, when push came to shove, he didn't want it, just like any other majority government didn't want. The guys with the power don't want to give up the power, right? So it makes it a very difficult thing, and yet here we are. We've got British Columbia, which is, from everything I read, on the verge of bringing in proportional representation. Now there, it was the NDP are the leaders of the government, and they have had a long, long time in the wilderness, and they understand that next time round they may not be the majority government, so at least let them have the number of seats in proportion of the popular vote. So they're bringing it in. Oh yes, I know there's resistance, yeah. Phyllis?
Hi. Just one comment and a question. When the political parties select their candidates, they do it by proportional representation. They do it by preferences. You know, it's already a system that's already being used in the parties when they nominate and select their candidates. No, there are a number of parties that have selected their candidates by preference. If the first person doesn't get enough votes, they knock off the last.
You're saying that there's a preferential vote system in some places.
That's right.
That's not the kind of system that'll work for the benefit of women or for better representation by popular vote, though.
Okay, I would agree with you, but at the same time, it's a start, even if it's not perfect.
No, but if you bring in that kind of system, it's not a start, it'll be the end. Everybody will say, because I don't think it works as well certainly for women and for representing all kinds of groups.
Okay, I guess I have to look at it again because that was my impression. And the other thing I wanted to ask you was, when Trudeau came in, he had a lot of women in his cabinet. Am I right? He had half.
50-50.
So what would be, if women came up with the idea of an organization, just guessing, what do you think his response might be? Because I get the feeling that he is a feminist, that he appreciates what women do. I just like your comments on that.
Well, I think that we have if we go to him for money, we have our best shot at getting it. Yeah. I would think he would think about it as this is I'll have women's votes for the future if I do this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because we would be very appreciative, right? Right?
Okay, it's just.
But I think he's our best shot. I mean, if Andrew Scheer gets in, well, the NDP, I mean, I don't know what their position would be, but he's right there right now, and he is putting more money towards women's issues. Not what I'd like to see, but
No.
It would be
But there's
certainly
an
worth.
election coming up, so,
Yeah. Got it. You should share it. Let's set it up first.
Linda, I'm wondering if we could think about other institutions of power, like the military, and what we have achieved since the Royal Commission on the Status of Women report that recommended better integration of women into the military. I mean, I think there have been some successes there, but there certainly continue to be very significant challenges, particularly in terms of sexual harassment. If one looks at the exclusion policies in the military, I think they've largely been overcome, particularly through the Canadian Human Rights Act and what the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal did in mandating that
Talking to the mic.
they integrate women into combat-supported positions, which is really quite a story that should be much more talked about, and maybe talking to those women who are now fairly well integrated. But there continues to be problems in the military of proper integration, as reports on harassment. So certainly the Canadian military. I'm also wondering about religious institutions and what can be done to challenge, take the best examples of how women have been integrated into religious institutions and challenge remaining other religious institutions who have long ways to go.
Have you got another hour? That was the problem. I set the title thinking that challenging the centers of power is what I want to talk about for the third lecture. And then I had to pick because I didn't have time. The military is certainly a very important area, and you're absolutely right. While there's been integration, there's still been problems. A book that was published last year around the same time as mine was, and by the way, my books are available for sale afterwards, and I'll even sign. Sandra Perrin, it's called Something Out in the Field, and she had been in the military and the infantry, I think, for many years, and she talks in that book about the treatment she received, including being tied up on a tree in the snow. I mean, she was raped and had to have an abortion, yet she stayed in the military. I mean, it was a real horror story. She managed to survive it. It appeared, because I was at the book launch and I met her afterwards. But that's, to me, a story of what happens in the military, that you can't necessarily see the patriarchal culture there, the masculine culture is so strong and so toxic that it's very difficult for some women to get past it. The same thing with the RCMP, the police structure, because they've been having trouble, even with people at the helm who've been trying to make change. So they finally put a woman in charge. I think that's wonderful that she's had a promotion, and I'm hoping the best for her. But that's a tough culture that's already there. But the problem is, how do we change all of these cultures? All of these cultures that are so male-focused. As I talked in my first lecture about the history, this is going back thousands of years, the difference between how men and women are treated where power is concerned. So how do you change the culture? Well, it's certainly not an overnight thing, but I certainly do think that to change the culture, women have to not absorb the pain, but speak out. And I think that that's something that the Me Too movement has shown with respect to sexual harassment and sexual assault. Speaking out can make a difference not only for themselves, but for all kinds of other women. And it puts it out to see the light of day. But we really have to change the culture in the military. So this woman wrote this book, but she left the military. She wrote the book after she left. But then on the other hand, I remember having a client in my early days in practice who got a job in one of the police type forces, and her stories were just awful, and there was nobody who would, at that time, that you could complain to who would do anything. And she eventually, she called me, she said, I'm out of here. That's it. She just wasn't going to do it. So, but you've got to be strong enough to do it. You can't sacrifice your life to it either. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question. Frequently in these discussions, we're talking about people who are very assertive and are willing to take on responsibilities. And I'm concerned about the caregivers for the children, that there are so many women in positions where they are subjugated for the advancement of certain women. How do we protect our child care workers so that they are not abused by women seeking power?
I'm not sure what you mean. You're saying that childcare workers would be, if woman seeking power hires a childcare worker, she's abusing her?
No, I'm saying that there are women whose jobs as nannies or daycare workers
Right.
are marginalized as a result of their employment, and that we, as women concerned about women, cannot ignore their situation.
Absolutely.
So how do we make that also a political issue, that we provide adequate, if not good, conditions for the people looking after children?
Well, I think that the concept of pay equity applies to everybody. And it certainly applies to domestic workers, childcare workers. But the fact is if the Ontario Human Rights Code, for example, I don't think that childcare workers and domestic workers are included in the protections under the Human Rights Code, for example. Of course, lawyers aren't either, but I guess they figure they can take care of themselves. I don't know. But the fact is that what we should be doing is ensuring that we have proper pay. I mean, the people who care for our children are caring for the future leaders of our society, and it's a very important job, and it's not given enough respect. It's part of the reason why we don't have a national child care program, is because I think the men in power do not understand the importance of the people who raise the children, whether it's the wives and mothers or it's child care workers who help with it. And absolutely, rights for them should be part of any consideration of pay equity. Yeah.
Hi. In looking around the room, there are not very many young people here. I'm just wondering, where are the millennials? Where are the young people? Do you know anything about their involvement in raising the status of women?
Millennials, I don't really know. Would anybody like to speak to that who may know about it? I'm looking at you. Sorry to put you on the spot,
no, it's
Sarah.
okay. I barely qualify as a millennial, actually, but.
Yeah, but you're one of the younger ones in the room.
I'm one of the younger ones, sure. You know what? I have a lot of outspoken, brilliant female friends who would probably be more than happy to be involved in the organization that you're talking about building. I think, I don't know, we're all just trying to figure out how to pay rent right now. and yeah, so I think there are so many women who would be, more than happy to participate, but I guess it's finding the right channels to reach them, because we're mostly all on social media. And I personally, I wouldn't have known about the lecture if you hadn't invited me. So I think it's finding the ways to reach them and bring them in.
But there's lots of feminists among them.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I talk to my feminist friends all the time about how we can, I guess further. I don't know, but how we can. Okay, so for example, last night, so I work in film, and a bunch of my friends organized an event at the Gladstone called, their organization is Women on Screen, and we had all these women come out and read excerpts from short films that they've been developing, and it was an amazing community of women, and we all commented on that, and the host of the evening, really pointed that out, that we are here to support each other and make connections, and like take advantage of all these amazing women in the same room. Anyway, I'm taking up all the time, but yeah, there is like a very strong force within young women.
That's my impression is that and young women are told that women have it all already, and when they actually live their lives, they wonder what's been passed over, that they've been given a line. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and the other thing, sorry, now that I have the mic, so the other thing I would say is just that I do feel that the older I get, the more important it is for me to make connections and friendships with women who are older than me, and to learn from them, and passing on that knowledge as well is so important. So anyway, thank you for being here and doing this.
I am a little older than you, Sarah. Thank you.
I agree with what the issue that the woman brought up about here we are, all feminists, all old, not all of us, but many of us. It needs to, your words need to go to the younger generations. Like, I can see you speaking in schools, and maybe starting with the private schools, because those are the schools that say, I'm
All
saying
boys?
this because they keep promoting that women can do anything. And so you need to start with a place where you're going to be heard, where people who may even have the money to donate to this new organization that's being formed, go into the public schools, the high schools. I think that's the level where kids need to be spoken to, and someone who's had the experience that you have had throughout your life in fighting for this cause, who has the history. Most of these young people have never heard of the National Action Committee. But I think there's a need. Just be the way that you two, the movement in the States got started. There has been this undercurrent of need, I think, amongst women to have somewhere to speak. And I think it's possible to create an organization like that. I'm not volunteering, but I think among much younger women that there's a place for this to happen. I feel it. And I have some younger people in my family. And the young women, they've got ideas and determination, and they're going to get out there and do it. I think you need to take that energy and get it made into some kind of organization.
And maybe add some history to it.
I just wanted to say that my 15-year-old granddaughter was going to come tonight, but she had too much homework. And she has become quite active because of this sex ed thing. And I've attended one of the rallies at Queen's Park. They've had more than one. They went out, the kids went out, from the schools and so on. And I think that, I know that she's certainly interested, and her friends, there are other kids her age who are. And that's one of the things that's going to capture their interest, is this sex ed thing. But what do we do in Ontario when we have a premier now who's on a rampage, going to tear down everything? It's hard to recruit people when you're in that position, because it's like banging your head against a brick wall. I know you're not partisan, but I think I think we all recognize what the issue is at the moment. That how do we get there, eh?
Yeah.
It's not like the old days where we had some hope.
That's it. I don't know what the answer is with somebody like that in office, and a cabinet that doesn't seem to be able or want to restrain him. Yeah, and the women in it. I think. Oh, sorry, Jay. You just.
A couple of
Okay.
thanks, Linda. A couple of things come to mind, and I'm sorry I missed number 2, but I'm here at number 3. Over 40 years ago, I had to fight to buy my own car, and I actually had to confront a salesperson who said, "Has your husband approved this sale?" I don't think I'm alone in that, because then I moved from a city to a rural area, and the attitude is very similar. But by now, I'm mature enough, and our young people have to be mature enough and be encouraged to stand up for that kind of thing, and at least be civilly, politely, definitely correcting what's going on in front of them. Some of the research I'm doing right now is on organizations. Our whole system, our whole country, our whole Ontario is based on a hierarchical, traditional, rational model of a top gun and those underneath. And until the top gun, well, I'm going to diverge a bit. A lot of the comments I hear from young women is, "I don't like politics. Politics is dirty." It doesn't have to be dirty, it can be smart. But they won't vote because they don't like politics. If this new organization hits the social media as a non-hierarchical type of organization such as Me Too, where people have a voice, which is their easiest way to get this voice is through social media, we might have some success. And we might have some success with the millennial group who wants to say something and are in the very position we were. We didn't know how to say it. We were drummed down for saying it. We were told we weren't polite, pat on the head little girls for saying this awful thing. And I think maybe if this new organization, where I hear some things happening, we might be able to construct an organization that doesn't look hierarchical, but yes, it has to be positively political in order to get the young people to say, "I recognize myself in there. Somebody responded to me when I had a complaint or a query or a question. I was put in touch with other women who might be able to answer that." I've lived that through, as I said in the first one, the Federation of Women Teachers, when they were strong. And that is very empowering. That makes people come to a microphone, and it makes young women say, "You know what, it isn't right, and I can do something about it." So just a thought.
Thank you, thank you. I think it needs to be collaborative, is what you're saying, the whole process. Yeah. Jay?
Linda, I'd like to think that maybe I fit that definition of male feminist. I hope so.
I granted you that. I grant you that.
You equated feminism, or included feminism, as one of the indicators of a more progressive society, part of the progressive movement, a sentiment with which I profoundly agree. My question, though, is, and this is looking at what a professor of mine once called that great Babylonian republic to the south. When President Trump was elected, the very first people to respond were women. There were women's demonstrations and organizations right across the nation. Even one, we happened at that time to be in Mexico, and there was even one in Puerto Vallarta. So Americans either temporarily or permanently abroad. And we've seen in these last congressional elections, the election of quite a number of relatively young women who ran on very progressive platforms, and in some cases substantially defeated well-known people who were identified as conservative, who were incumbents, some of whom had substantial NRA funding. Is there a momentum here, and is there some way in Canada that you think that women can tap into that kind of momentum, if indeed it's there?
Well, thank you. That's a very good point, because really there is a lot of action in the States. We all, I think, were so impressed by the kinds of people, the kinds of women who got elected. And things were so bad with Trump and with how he handled it. I mean, do we really need to make it that bad in order for everybody to get up and fight? But it was there. I mean, that was when the women decided that they would fight it. And it's phenomenal what they've accomplished and are continuing to accomplish. And I think it certainly is a good thought to ride on those coattails. Because we're not immune. We sit here and listen to his nonsense on the news every night and all day long, and feel the same way I think that they did. But we figure, well, we can't do anything about him, but we certainly can do something about our own example of that type of thinking. We all know who I'm talking about. Suzanne?
Hi, Linda. I work in a university archives, and I often have to do archival literacy classes with women's studies groups, or classes. And it's amazing how many young women don't know the history at all of how they achieved how they've managed to achieve what they do have. And once you expose them to it, depending on the records that we can provide to them, it's amazing how it lights a fire under them. But I also think the Me Too thing has really caused them to wake up. And I even think things like The Handmaid's Tale. The television program has made big impression on them, especially with Trump in office. And I'm always amazed at the young students who work for me, the undergrads who are coming through the system now. I have to keep reminding myself I'm old enough to be their grandmother for some of them. But they don't even have to read The Handmaid's Tale in school anymore, which really surprised me. But once they do, they get really angry. And I think they are coming around. But they need to learn what the history is, because they don't get it until they hit the wall themselves. And then, well, why is that, right? Why can't I do this? So I think they're primed, but the story has to go to them. So I just want to say that.
Thank you. Thank you, yeah. Well, I was talking with another guest here this evening about the importance of bringing this to the schools, and somebody actually asked that question as well. Okay.
Well, actually,
I think this better be the last question.
Really follows on perfectly from what you were saying, and the education piece, because you do find, I mean, if we do not explore the history and expose it to younger people, they think life has always been like that. And a perfect example for me the other night was listening to CBC Radio, and which is the program that's just 50 years, As It Happens. And they had some historical stuff on it, and they had a clip of Barbara Budd interviewing a hockey team owner with a male co-host, and he would not accept a question from her. He said he wouldn't speak to a woman. Get back into your box, sort of thing. And he repeated it over and over again. And eventually slammed the phone down, and because she insisted on asking a question. But she did it incredibly politely and very low-key, like many women do when they're trying to challenge power. And so the whole thing went dead. But what really, I think, upset me was her male co-host said when they put the phone up, oh, we've lost him now. Oh, he's obviously upset. Maybe we should call him back. And, you know, just clips like that, if you played that to young people and say, this is in the 70s, you know, this cannot happen again. Once they become aware of it, they would be outraged to hear that now. And nobody really turned a hair. That's what was so surprising. And I think it's these details that if you were going into schools and you could bring together the history in a very real way like that, and you say, this is an example of it, that you'd certainly get the younger people on side, and those people who don't believe really they need feminism.
Right, thank you. Thank you, that's a very good point. Okay. We're going to allow one more question here. Did you want to say something, Rose?
Well, I was just going to say that, so this is the work that I do, Canadian women's history in schools. And so I've been advocating and as a stakeholder at all those ministry meetings for decades in Ontario. And there is no gender equity in our history curriculum, period. It's never been a priority for the Ontario government, under whoever it is. Kathleen Wynne took the step to create a gender equity course that was separate from history education. And so there's a long way to go, and every time I'd bring it up at the meetings, I was always shut down as somebody who was being, annoying again, and was told at the last meeting when the social studies history curriculum changed in 2013 that small steps, Rose, that's what they'd say. That's what they said to me, small steps.
Small.
So it's just not
You know what?
there.
That's like
And
voluntary.
I know.
Small steps,
But I think it's, I have a women's history talk series called Her Stories Cafe. You can look it up online. And so, but one of the things that we're going to start doing now is, and I've worked already with a couple of schools, where I get panels of teachers who are going to talk about the ways they include women in the classroom. And we're going to have these talks. So those are little steps. And you and I have talked about getting some things into the schools. So,
Thanks.
yeah.
Thank you, Rose. I think that ends the evening and the lecture series, and thank you all for coming.